Imagine you spent years building what feels like a solid life. You got a car with all the features, a house that impresses guests, a closet full of things that signal you've made it. You work hard, you spend reasonably, and on paper everything looks fine. And then something shifts, not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly. The way fog rolls in before a storm, the economy begins to contract. Jobs disappear, prices spike. The news starts using words like recession, then crisis, then something nobody quite has a name for yet. And suddenly you look around at everything you own, and you realize some of it is completely useless, not just unnecessary, not just inconvenient, useless. Dead weight in a world that has changed its rules without telling you. This is the moment most people never prepare for. Not because they're careless, but because we're psychologically wired to plan for the world we're living in, not the world that might be coming. Today we're going to talk about 5 purchases that quietly become worthless when economic collapse begins. Not to frighten you, not to predict the future, but to teach you something deeper about the difference between things that hold value and things that only feel like they do when conditions are comfortable. Because that's the real lesson here. Value is conditional. Most people never examine that condition until it's gone. The first purchase is the premium subscription lifestyle. Think about your monthly financial footprint: streaming services, software subscriptions, gym memberships, cloud storage, meal kits, music platforms, premium apps. Individually, each one feels small, justified, a reasonable quality of life upgrade. But together, they form something economists rarely talk about: a fixed cost floor, a baseline burn rate that exists whether you earn or not. In a stable economy, this is merely expensive. In a collapsing one, it becomes dangerous. Here's the part most people miss. When income becomes uncertain, the subscription model doesn't bend with you. It keeps charging, and the psychological trap is that people keep paying long after they should stop. Because canceling feels like admitting defeat. It feels like losing the life they worked to build. The purchase itself isn't the problem. The invisible dependency is. When you build a life on recurring access rather than ownership, you don't own your lifestyle. You're renting it. And in a crisis, landlords don't negotiate. The second purchase is the new car bought at the peak of borrowing confidence. There's a version of this story that plays out in every economic downturn. Someone buys a new vehicle, well-intentioned, seemingly sensible, with a payment that worked at their current income, maybe even comfortable. Then the income changes. The car doesn't. A vehicle financed during prosperity becomes one of the most punishing assets in a collapse. It depreciates immediately. It requires insurance. It demands fuel. And unlike a mortgage, you can't easily renegotiate its terms. You can't rent it out. You can't sell it for what you owe. It just sits there, costing you money every single month, no matter what the world around it is doing. This is what Charlie Munger described as the trap of conflating comfort with wisdom. Something can feel completely rational and be quietly devastating because the reasoning was built on assumptions that no longer hold. The monthly payment that felt reasonable at full income becomes a crisis at reduced income. This is not bad luck. This is mathematical inevitability. This is where the trap gets deeper. The third purchase is status-driven real estate beyond actual need. Housing is interesting because it exists in a strange psychological space. It's practical and emotional simultaneously. People don't just buy homes, they buy identity. They buy the neighborhood, the school district, the square footage that signals something to everyone else. And in a growing economy, that identity comes with real estate appreciation to support it. But economic collapse reorganizes the housing market in brutal ways. Suddenly, the oversized mortgage that felt manageable becomes a cliff edge. Suddenly, the premium neighborhood that felt like an investment reveals how much of its value was sentiment rather than substance. This doesn't mean all real estate collapses. It means the gap between what people bought and what they actually needed becomes visible and expensive. The pattern repeats across every recorded economic crisis. People overbought square footage. They overbought prestige. And when the conditions changed, they were anchored to obligations their circumstances could no longer support. The trap isn't real estate. The trap is buying what markets were selling at their most optimistic and assuming that optimism was permanent. The fourth purchase is the high-end luxury brand investment. There is a popular belief, reinforced by decades of marketing, that luxury goods hold their value, that a premium watch, a designer bag, a rare collector's item is more than a purchase. It's a store of wealth. And in some narrow cases, for some specific items, this has historical precedent. But here's what people rarely examine. The secondary market for luxury goods depends entirely on a base of buyers who have discretionary income. And discretionary income is precisely what disappears when economies contract. In a genuine collapse, the market for non-essential luxury goods does not just soften, it vanishes. Not because the item lost craftsmanship, but because the audience willing to pay for it temporarily ceased to exist. This is the hidden cost of treating luxury as insurance. Its value is socially constructed, and social construction requires a functioning, confident economy to sustain it. The piece of art, the limited edition sneaker, the vintage wine collection, all of these are worth exactly what someone will pay for them on the day you need to sell. And that day, in a crisis, looks very different from the day you bought. The fifth purchase is advanced education bought without understanding its return. This one is the most uncomfortable, because it challenges something people are deeply conditioned to believe. Education is almost universally framed as the safe investment, the one that always pays off, the credential that protects you, and in many circumstances this is true. But economic collapse creates conditions where credential inflation and debt load intersect in devastating ways. People who spent years accumulating expensive degrees in fields that have contracted find themselves overqualified for available work, undersupported by their savings, and anchored to loan obligations that don't pause for economic reality. This is not a critique of education. It's an examination of a system that sold certainty in an uncertain world. The question we're sitting with is this: was the education purchased as a genuine skill-building exercise, or was it purchased as a social signal? Because in a collapse, signals stop working, skills remain. The credential on the wall doesn't feed anyone, the ability to produce something valuable does. So what's the pattern underneath all five? Every single purchase on this list has one thing in common. It was optimized for stable conditions. Each one made complete sense in a world where income was reliable, credit was available, markets were liquid, and confidence was high. None of them were designed to function when the underlying conditions disappeared. This is what most financial education misses. It teaches you how to navigate a rising economy. It rarely teaches you how to examine whether what you've built would survive a falling one. The shift isn't about becoming pessimistic. It's about becoming precise. There's a difference between things that have value because conditions support them and things that have value because they produce something real, regardless of conditions. Understanding that difference quietly and without urgency is one of the most important financial frameworks a person can carry, not because collapse is inevitable, but because the thinking required to survive one is actually the thinking required to build genuine wealth in any environment. Ownership over access, skills over signals, needs over wants, resilience over optimization. These aren't survival principles, they're wealth principles, the kind that don't require a crisis to prove their worth. The final thought is this: every generation that lives through a major economic disruption comes out the other side with a different relationship to money. Not because they read about it, because they felt what it was like when things they thought were solid turned out to be conditional. You don't have to wait for that moment to learn its lesson. The question isn't whether your life would survive a collapse. The question is whether you understand right now which parts of your financial life are real and which parts are simply borrowing stability from an economy that might not always lend it. That distinction, quietly understood, changes everything.